If I were a rich man, yagga-digga-digga-digga-digga-digga-digga-dum. All day long I'd biddy-biddy-bum if I were a wealthy man.
Spoiler alert.
I'm going to be talking about major plot points of this movie, big character moments, people who show up, people who don't show up, the twists, the turns, the amazing, the bad, and the frustrating that is Spider-Man No Way Home and all that juicy stuff. So go watch the movie. It's pretty damn fun. Don't let me ruin the movie for ya. Sounds good? Alright, perfect. Let's do this thing. 3, 2, 1, let's go. Spider-Man No Way Home. Oh boy, yeah. Now, I'm gonna be completely honest. I was one of those few people who were the overly critical and cynical, who consumed all the trailers, media coverage, and rumors, who felt like, meh, this could go two ways. This could hit it out of the park and fly sky high like Spider-Man swings through the skyscrapers of New York, or completely hit rock bottom like Gwen Stacy's neck. Now, before we get into the really oversaturated plot and the plenty of fan service that this movie delivers on, what are my thoughts of MCU Spidey before No Way Home? And I really hate to be that guy, but I was never the biggest fan of the MCU version of Spider-Man. I always felt that he was way too tied down to the overall structure of the MCU and never had time to fully grow in the 5 years that he's been in this universe. But with this crazy plot and movie that is Spider-Man No Way Home, Tom Holland's Spider-Man finally grows because of the villain.
Hello, Peter.
The villains. Now, if you haven't left yet because of spoilers,
Shut up. Get out.
please leave because I'm finally going to get into some major plot points. So with the villains, it was absolutely amazing to see all of my favorites back from each of the two respective franchises that was in Sam Raimi's Spider-Man trilogy and Mark Webb's Spider-Man duology. This is unfortunately where I get into some of my major complaints with this movie and why I think it's kind of frustrating but also still an amazing experience of a movie is because not all of the villains were handled well. Actually, only 2 of them were handled well, which was Doc Ock and Green Goblin respectively. The rest, besides Electro, were the bench warmers, which was Sandman and the Lizard. Now, I'm not saying every villain had to be handled with 100% worth of care, but I felt instead of telling stupid jokes every 5 minutes, the film could have slowed down and showed the depth of these villains and the complexity that of the forgotten empathy that Andrew and Tobey showed both Sandman and the Lizard to showcase the confusion of the overall villains and how they feel and how all of them are just confused souls trapped in their own grief and tragedy. But nope, we get the bare minimum of that and all we get are just dumb jokes with all the villains. And I'm not saying banter or humor is a bad thing, it's just like I wanted to see some depth with these villains and we really get that with Doc Ock and especially the Green Goblin and a little bit with Electro, but Sandman and Lizard were just there for jokes. And yes, they were saved by the end of the movie, but it didn't feel as earned as the other ones because they were just there for humor.
Shut up. Get out.
And I don't hate humor and banter altogether. I just feel like the MCU definitely has some very forceful jokes. And honestly, in this movie, it was just too much and really on the nose of fan service with some of the dialogue, with a lot of the jokes. You know, there's a lot of memes out there with the Raimi trilogy, and of course, they really use some dialogue that everyone will know, which I'm okay with for a nice little laugh, but honestly, it was just a little much. And that was one of my main frustrations with this movie, that there were just too many jokes and too many of them placed in the wrong scenes and really killing the tone of those certain scenes. Like at the very end battle when Electro is finally depowered, Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man is having a nice moment with him and talking with him, and he had to make some weird joke that he thought Spider-Man was black because he was from Queens. Something like that is completely unnecessary in the final fight, in my opinion. Just get to the emotional stuff. And that's also something I really wish we could have gotten. More emotional scenes of the villains. We got some, but I wish we could have gotten more. But one of the best part of this movie is Tom Holland's performance as Spider-Man. I was genuinely surprised with Tom Holland. I was never the biggest fan of him in Homecoming and Far From Home as Spider-Man, but honestly, he was at the top of his game in this movie. Same goes to Alfred Molina and Willem Dafoe as Doc Ock and Green Goblin. The acting and performances were fantastic. Like, I will never ever complain about more Willem Dafoe as Green Goblin. And Willem Dafoe always kills us as an actor, and the fight scenes between him and Tom was top notch in any Spider-Man and even a comic book film. It was brutal, intense, and had a lot of consequences, and that's another great thing about this movie, is that there are actual real stakes and consequences, unlike the 2 previous movies in the Homecoming trilogy. And because of that, Aunt May dies. The death scene was handled as best as it could, and the reason I say that is because unfortunately Aunt May was mostly played off as a joke in Homecoming and in Far From Home. But it was Tom Holland's performance that carried the death scene and did make that scene that much better, since I never really cared much about this version of Aunt May. After Aunt May's death scene, when all the villains are at Happy's apartment, or before that, that was when the film really kicked off, because it started off really rough. But once the emotion and darkness kicked in the film, it took a different turn and got really good after that. But with most of my major complaints out of the way, and the meat and potatoes of the movie, of course, you guys want me to talk about the two goats, the two that shaped my childhood, Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man. Man, is it still surreal to me that they are in this movie. These two were obviously the best things in this movie, and the characters that were handled the best. The jokes, the banter were fun, and overall it was great seeing them return in their respective roles. One of the best scenes in this movie was with Tom Holland's Spider-Man, and when it was him dealing with Aunt May's death. It was so great because John Watts really directed this scene so well, showcasing each Spider-Man's grief. Tobey's Uncle Ben, Andrew's Gwen, and Tom Holland's Aunt May. Showing the wiser, experienced Spider-Man through Tobey, the broken Spider-Man through Andrew, and the inexperienced Spider-Man through Tom. It was great to see each of them sharing their experiences and what villains they had fought in the past. And both Tobey and Andrew Garfield both put in a really great performance, and they both felt like their respective Spider-Mans, but also at the same time they also felt authentic. And the action scenes between all three Spider-Man were great, and also the humor between all three of them were also pretty good as well for the most part. Some jokes didn't land, but for the most part they were actually pretty good, unlike some of the villain jokes. Most of the side characters I thought were handled pretty well. MJ especially, she had a lot of good emotional scenes with Peter, and Zendaya's performance was also solid as well. Ned, on the other hand, went through something quite interesting. I bring this up because Ned was able to use Doctor Strange's magic for some reason with the bare minimum of explanation, which I thought was kinda odd and a little unnecessary. I know some of the complaints I've mentioned so far for some might be minor, but for me it was really distracting for the overall structure this movie was trying to pull off. Seeing Tobey, Andrew, and all the villains returning was amazing, but I wanted more from the returning characters because they got sent back so fast. I wish maybe we could have seen Tobey's life and also Andrew's life where they are in their own universes. With some problems, it is great to see Tom's Spider-Man really learn to be responsible and learn pain and loss to grow as the Spider-Man I know from the comics. And yes, I still believe Into the Spider-Verse and Spider-Man 2 are the best Spider-Man movies because Spider-Verse wasn't a Spider-Verse movie for the sake of being a Spider-Verse movie, but that the movie was a love letter to Spider-Man, and with all those characters, it's to showcase anyone can wear the mask. And I feel No Way Home, unfortunately, was more sold on a nostalgia than an emotional movie, but with the stuff that they did do emotionally, it did pull it off the best that it could. I wasn't the biggest fan of it, but I thought it did pull it off the best it could. And the end result was something special and a love letter to 3 generations of Spider-Man fans and to Spider-Man. And I feel frustrated with the movie and amazed at the same time, and I feel some of the villains were lackluster, but finally seeing Tom Holland grow with the support of Tobey and Andrew's Spider-Man was absolutely something special. And maybe I need to see it a third time to get the full picture of the movie's purpose, but I grew with these Spider-Men. Tobey, who's my favorite, I grew up with as a kid. Andrew, who's my favorite actor to don the Spidey mask, I was a teenager with him, and now a young adult with Tom's Spider-Man. And as Spider-Man, I can now see myself more interested in seeing more stories from because of his growth. The final swing in this movie is everything I wanted for this version of Spider-Man, a sign of growth like it always should be. The final swing should show the heroic, the responsibility that Spider-Man represents, but also a haunting reminder of what the character has gone through and what else is to come. I cheered, I rooted, I felt frustrated and amazed of what No Way Home pulled off. It may not be the best Spider-Man or a perfect movie, but it was a very flawed and the best MCU Spider-Man entry so far, and that's because it was a love letter and honoring of what came before.